Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over objects in JavaScript. This is actually quite a gigantic topic. It turns out this applies to pretty much everything inside the language. Back when we learned about primitive types, there were a lot of data types that we learned. Then we also learned about arrays. And now objects are kind of the final data type that we need to learn, but it really is kind of the underlying thing that kind of helps with all of the data types. That might seem a bit confusing, and there's a lot to unpack there, so let's just get right into it. Okay, so here I have a couple of drawings as usual to just kind of explain how these things in JavaScript actually work. And as usual, we're also going to go through the code together. I have quite a few things that we're going to need to learn about objects in order to even get kind of the basics or the surface down so that we can actually do useful things with them. So to start, I just want to show you a bit of the syntax for objects and some definitions. Super exciting stuff, so let's go through it as fast as we can. Okay, so here I have a const called person. And I'm pointing it at this thing, which is new for the first time that we're seeing, which is an object literal syntax. So what that means is previously we saw that we could kind of assign primitive types like numbers and booleans and things like that, strings, to variables. We also learned about arrays and how we can assign that to variables. And we also learned about functions and how we can assign those to variables. So think of object as just another type that we can assign to variables. In this case, the syntax that we use, or the characters that we use to denote an object to make sure that everyone understands it's different from an array and a function. For example, JavaScript will look at this and know that it's an object right away, and so will any human. We use these curly brackets. Now, we used curly brackets before for things like if statements and loops. However, those always had something before them. In this case, these kind of are standalone. They stay by themselves. So these purple curly brackets that I have here and here, they kind of denote the start and the end of an object in JavaScript. Okay. So now for some more definitions, and I know this might seem a little dry to start, but it's really important to get these definitions down because as you read documentation or you try to communicate your ideas with other developers, or even try to learn online about these kinds of things, these are the terms that are used everywhere, and some people kind of mix and match them, which makes things confusing. So really knowing the ins and outs of these really helps and goes a long way. So that said, let's look at the three primary terms when it comes to objects. We have a property, which is a pair of a key and a value, okay, which we're going to learn next. In this case, this is a property right here, this ID :42, and then we have a comma at the end. In this particular person object, I have three properties. Okay, the pair ID 42, name Alex, and then age 19. All right, so the left-hand side of the property is called the key, which is what I have denoted here in blue. And then the right-hand side of the property after the colon is the value, which I have here in green. So a property consists of a key and a value. Now in JavaScript, modern JavaScript at least, allows us to kind of fudge around with the keys a little bit so that we can make it easier for us as programmers to actually type this out in practice. And we'll see what this looks like. But what the main thing to keep in mind is that keys in objects are only strings. Okay, in this case, it looks like I just lied to you, right? Because these things don't look like strings, these look like variables. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. Behind the scenes, JavaScript is going to turn ID into the string ID for us. Same with name, it's going to be the string name. These are not variables. These are property names or keys inside of this person object, and they're going to be stringified or turned into strings by JavaScript automatically for us so that we don't always have to type the quotes for the keys. Now that kind of brings us to some tricky cases later when we do things like using Boolean names or numbers as keys. It turns out those all get turned into strings behind the scenes as well, which can lead to a little bit of confusion, but I'll try to cover that as best as I can. The values, however, the thing on the right-hand side of the colon, can be literally anything in JavaScript. Okay, it can be any primitive type, it can be an array, it can be a function, it can even be another object. Okay, so eventually, as we kind of get more practice with JavaScript, we're going to see ample examples of all of these. But to start, let's go with kind of the basics just so that we have a really good fundamental understanding of how this works. So before we get to the code, I want to go through a memory representation of what this looks like inside the actual computer's RAM, or the computer's memory. So over here, I have the same object on the left-hand side. Right over here, I have person. Person is pointing to an object, which is what the curly brackets are. And this object has the same three properties: ID of 42, name Alex, and age 19. Okay. ID is pointing to a number, which is 42. Name is pointing to the value Alex, which is a string, and age is pointing to a number, which is 19. This person object in memory would look like this. All right. You can think of person as pointing to this block right here at the start. And this block has these values inside of it. And JavaScript automatically knows where these are behind the scenes. So you can think of it kind of invisibly handling somewhere else these names, the actual keys. Okay, so ID, name, and age are stored in a similar table as well, just so it can help keep track of the keys and which each of the keys are pointing to. But technically speaking, they're all pointing to these values inside of the table, inside of memory, and this is what the person object actually is. Okay? So this leads to an interesting question. When we looked at primitive types, we saw that when we change a value for a primitive type and we create another variable, for example, if I created like an age 2 and I pointed at age, I would actually get a copy of age, which is 19. But then we saw that kind of broke down when it came to arrays, because when it came to arrays, we have large chunks of memory, potentially thousands or millions of items long, and it was very inefficient for JavaScript to assume that we want a copy of that every single time. So we actually just pointed to the start of the array, and we were able to actually manipulate items inside of it. That had the side effect of making everything that points at that array change it. So I just wanted to show this diagram right here. I had one ready before, but I'll switch to that right after. This is denoting that exact example. Okay, so I have the same person, and it's pointing to this area in memory here with 42, Alex, and 19. I'm creating another variable, and I'm pointing that variable at person. What that does is that follows where person points at and points to the same spot in memory. It doesn't actually create a copy of this chunk of memory so that we can change it independently of person. It is actually the exact same space as person. So if I was to change natter, I would be changing person, which is the same behavior that we get for arrays. Okay, so just something to keep in mind and be careful with. The rationale for this is the exact same as with arrays as well. We do this because these objects can get quite large and contain a very, very large amount of keys and values. And to create copies of these all the time, unintentionally, would become very expensive and make JavaScript very slow. So what it does to save kind of memory and speed behind the scenes is it just refers to these directly using these pointers. Now I mentioned changing values. And this is the last thing I want to show you before we actually get into the code, is we can change these values for each key inside of an object like so, like right here. So we have the same person object pointing to this area in memory. To change the ID value, which used to be 42, and update it to be 44, we would use something that looks like this. We would say person, square brackets, and instead of using an index, like with an array like 0, 1, 2, 3, we would actually use the key instead, which is in quotes because it's a string, so all keys are strings. Okay, be careful to give it a string here, as opposed to a variable. If you give it a variable, it'll take that variable and turn that variable into a string. Hopefully it is already a string, but it would use that variable's value as the key. Okay, so if that variable is pointing to like hello, it would be using hello as the key. We'll see examples of that later, but just keep that in mind. So in this case, we're saying go to person, find the ID property and change it to change the value to 44, which is why this permanently gets changed, because anytime we change person or anything that is also pointing to person, like I had here, where if I was to do this with Natter, for example, the exact same code, it would also change this person object. Okay, because you see person and Natter here are pointing to the same space in memory. Okay, sorry for the flipping back and forth. They're very related diagrams. So another way to change the object is using this dot syntax. And this is usually preferred because programmers like to save keystrokes and it's a little bit neater to look at. However, there are some caveats with this syntax. For example, if your key has a space in it, you can't use this method to change the value. You have to use the square bracket method. And I'll leave it to you as an exercise to think of why, but JavaScript would get very confused and would not understand which part of the variable name and the key name and what the update is. So you can use this if the key is just one kind of word, but if you have 2 words or more, you would want to use syntax like this. You can use this syntax all the time, it'll work no matter what, but this syntax is definitely shorter and easier, and my preferred syntax and most people's preferred syntax, especially if you use things like camel casing to kind of get rid of that issue with spacing inside of the key names anyways. So here I'm changing the name to be Ezra, and you can see that right here it's the final value of this object after running all of this code from top to bottom would be this block in memory right here, where the ID is now changed to 44 permanently. We've lost 42, and the name has been changed to Ezra, and we've lost the string Alex in this case. Okay, perfect. So before we get to the code, I just want to give you a way to kind of look up this stuff by yourself, because I find that very important and an often skipped step. So as usual, let's pull up Google. And in Google, I'd like you to search for JavaScript object. Hopefully you're slowly getting a hang for searching for these things in JavaScript as you're doing the exercises and other things as you're going through these videos. As always, I like going through to the MDN web docs when I actually look at the results for JavaScript. If they're available, they're not always available for the thing that you're searching, but for most of the starter things that we're going to be going through in this series together, at least in the beginning portion, is going to be on MDN. Okay, so I'm going to click on that one, and I get kind of this page, which is the object page for JavaScript. Now, a bit of warning. There is a lot going on this page. You can actually see, even here on the left hand side, there is just a lot of these methods, very similar to arrays. If you looked at the array page, it was also quite overwhelming at the start. But then we started learning some of the methods like map and filter and reduce and some other things, and you can slowly start to see how eventually you can increase your understanding of these methods and built-in objects. Even after using JavaScript for many years, I cannot remember all of these off the top of my head. There's just no way. In fact, I would go as far as saying that it's actually probably a disservice to yourself to try to memorize everything in here. That's not to say that you should try to remember the most important ones. That's definitely very important. You want to kind of remember, and you naturally will as you start using them over time, the most important methods for the most basic objects. But eventually, it's better value for your cognitive load in your brain to actually just outsource that information storage and retrieval to a search engine like Google and documentation like MDN and others. Okay, I would go far as saying as eventually when you become a really, really good programmer, and the best programmers in the world actually try to memorize as little as possible and know how to look stuff up when they need it. That way, the core stuff is kind of in their brain, but they can quickly retrieve information from the internet because stuff changes all the time, and versions change, and these methods change, and APIs change all the time. Okay, so sheer memorization takes you a little bit, but don't take it too far and try to memorize everything in here. Sorry for that tangent. I just thought it was very important because now we're getting into more complicated topics inside of JavaScript together. All right, so the reason we came to this page was I just wanted to kind of give you a place to actually just read up on this topic if you're interested about it, because it's actually one of the central topics in JavaScript. Everything pretty much in JavaScript ends up being an object one way or another to some degree. There are primitive types and there's a whole bunch of stuff behind them as well. But in general, once you start using JavaScript a lot to create things like web pages or backend or front end or different apps for desktop or mobile, what you'll see is you're going to end up running into objects everywhere, just all the time for everything. And knowing how to work with them, manipulate them, change them, update them is really, really an important skill to develop. So this page is a fantastic resource to really learn about it. There are many other pages on the internet that talk about objects a lot, but this is a really good reference to understand how they work. That doesn't mean you should sit and read all these top to bottom, but this is an example of somewhere where you could come to learn some of these methods. We're actually going to go through some of these ourselves right now. So for example, entries is something we're going to look at. There's another one in here. I'm just going to try to find it. Keys is another one that we're going to look at. Let's just read this one out real quick because we're actually going to use it shortly. This method returns an array containing the names of all the given objects' own enumerable string properties. Now this sounds really fancy, but in plain English, this will give us the keys of our object as an array. Okay, and we'll see this in action. This own enumerable stuff gets a bit fancy and complicated as we need to learn more about things like prototypes and descriptors, which we'll get into future videos. Object values does kind of the reverse of that. It gives us not the keys, but the values. Okay, and this also goes through how you can do things, I believe, like deleting things from an object, which we'll also see together, or checking to see if a key is actually inside an object or not. So that said, let's get right to the code. I'm going to pull up Visual Studio Code and I'm going to start making some files in here. The first one I'll make is objects-intro.js. Okay, so let's just create a really basic object to start and then start seeing how we can manipulate it and change it and access properties, change properties, and all that kind of fundamental behavior. So I'll create a const. I'll call it animal. And I'm going to do an equal sign and then the curly brackets. I'm going to give myself some space so that I can have a bunch of properties listed one after the other so it looks nice and neat. You can also do this on one line. It doesn't really matter, whatever looks better for you. I actually have a program that runs and reformats my code behind the scenes automatically for me to match this style anyways, every time I save the file. So let's give this animal a couple of keys and values, a couple of properties, right? So we can give it strings as keys directly, and we can give it, for example, that value. So I can give it a string ID as a key and a value of 42, which is a number. If I save this file, you'll see that my program that runs behind the scenes just gets rid of the strings. And that's kind of what I was hinting at before. A lot of the time when you see objects in JavaScript and you're working on teams or you see it online, you'll see the syntax that kind of looks like this. And this is because for many reasons, it's just neater to read this. It's less typing. It's already known that all of the keys are always going to be strings anyways. So it just saves a lot of typing and it's just much nicer to look at and quicker to kind of look through and understand objects if you don't have all these quotes everywhere if you don't need them. But don't be fooled that this is definitely a string. Okay, this is the string ID as the key. This is just a short form syntax that pretty much everybody uses. I'm going to do the same thing for name. I'm going to say my animal's name is rar. And I'll say that my animal's type can be dog. Okay. So let's go with that to start. Notice, however, on the right-hand side, I do need the strings. And I'll show you why that is later. And that's because we can actually use variables as the values, which again we'll go through shortly. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That the keys are 100% all the time, no matter what, going to be turned into strings. The values can be anything. So in this case, we have to explicitly tell it it's the string rar and the string dog. So let's console log this out and see what we get. So if I do console log and I say animal, let me pull up my terminal here. Make sure I'm in the right folder. I'm going to do a node objects intro. And most environments, for example, the browser and Node.js in this case, are going to print out the object in kind of a nice pretty form like this. You can see that it even gets rid of the quotes around the keys because frankly, they're quite annoying to just show up everywhere. Everyone already knows that they're strings. So we have 3 properties. We have one property with called ID with a value of 42, which is a number, another property called name with a value of rar, which is a string, and another property called type with a value of, or the key is type and the value is dog, which is a string. Okay, so that's how we would kind of read that out. Now, how do we change these values around? So let's say I want to change my animal's name to be something else. Well, I'll go through the 2 syntaxes for this. The first one is using the square brackets. Very similar to how we use an array. So if this was an array, for example, we might try to get index 1 because this is the second one inside of the second kind of property inside of animals. That's not how we kind of index into an object in JavaScript. We always have to give it the name of the key that we want to index to. So in this case, you can see that my editor is actually helping me out a little bit. It knows that animal is an object and it knows I'm trying to access these keys. In fact, if I hover over it, you can see that it's actually telling me that's exactly all the 3 things in there. You might not have this depending on kind of which version of Visual Studio Code you're using or what extensions you have installed. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is that you're kind of following along as we're going through this together. So I'm going to say, I want to go to animal, square brackets, string, and the key I'm interested in is name. I want to change the name to be a new string. So I'm going to assign a new string to that name key. And in this case, let's just say my name is going to be Moo. Okay. Now if I console log animal, oh my goodness, that's not console log at all. Console log animal. Let me run this one more time, and we can see that animal starts off with this object, but we've changed it permanently to now be this object. So we've lost rar as our animal name. Name is now permanently pointing to Moo. Okay. So another way that we can change a property is using the dot syntax. And I'll do this one more time down here, except this time with the type. So let's just say I want to say animal dot type now. This is the same thing as saying animal and then square brackets quotes type, right? Just like we did for name. We could do the same thing for type. This is just a shorter syntax, and it only works if the property name or the key is a single word. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. But let's reassign this to be a cow, which makes sense for Moo. And then we'll console log out animal one more time. All right, clear this out just so we have some space. And you can see that our animal starts off as rar as a dog, changes to Moo, which is still a dog, and then changes that to be a cow right after, and the name is still Moo. Okay, so we transformed it twice, and now it's permanently ID 42, name Moo, and type cow. Okay, so here's something interesting. Let's say we wanted to add a property that has 2 kind of words in it. How would we do that? So for example, let's just say something like num legs, like number of legs, right? For whatever reason, you want to store this for your animal. I would need to do this. I would need to explicitly put quotes inside of the object to kind of show that there's a space inside of this key. So now I can say that there is 4, the value for this key is 4. Okay, and I'll show you what happens if we don't do that in a second. So if I run this, you can see that now we have a num legs key, which points to the value 4 for this object every single time. But you can imagine, right? If I get rid of these quotes, take a look at kind of what this looks like. you can imagine why JavaScript would kind of be confused by this, right? Because usually spaces mean we are kind of doing a new thing in JavaScript, right? Like in this case, we have a space and then equals and then the new thing that we want, right? And we have spaces here or commas here to separate things out, or colons, right? So JavaScript doesn't really know what to do with this because it's confused. Is num a word? Is it a variable? Is it something special? And what about legs? And what am I doing with all these things? It gets really, really confused. So in the case of something like this, you'd want to use the quotes explicitly to type out that key. So let's say we want to do something like very similar where we have two words, but this time we want to do it in a slightly different way. So the way I would suggest you to do this is like this. I would say num legs is 4, just like that. Okay, and this is using camel case, where we kind of split up the word using an uppercase letter for every new word following the first word, and the first one is still lowercase. Okay, the reason for this is I'll show you in a second. It makes it much easier to change, and if you're consistent, it's just as easy to read, right? So if I log this out, you'll see that now these are two different properties because they are two different names, two totally different names. This one has a space and this one has no space, right? And a capital L. So in this case, you see that JavaScript, or in this case Node, actually added the quotes because it needed to do that because it would get very confusing to read this object without those quotes there for that key. But for num leg, since it's camel case and it's still just one word, it didn't need to do that. So I'm going to change these so you can see what I mean and why it's easier probably to use camel casing for most cases. So if I wanted to change this property, line 5, num legs with a space, I would have to use this method, right? I would have to say animal at num legs, right? And let's say our cow like grew a leg and now it has 5 legs, right? Just for sake of example. I would have to do it this way, right? And if I console.log out animal, you'll see that this actually works as intended, right? Now num legs has been changed to 5. Okay, so that is slightly annoying for a lot of people to do this over and over again, kind of this longer form for imagine like a dozen properties maybe over the course of a file. It might get kind of annoying. So a lot of people would just prefer to do this animal.numLegs equals to 5. Okay, so just to really clarify why we can't do this with this one. Oops, num legs. Right? If you look at this line, this line doesn't really make sense if you think about it. It's a really, really confusing line, right? Because of the space, the same thing that we saw here. Also, we can't really do this. That's not really allowed when it comes to indexing into objects in JavaScript. So you have to use this syntax if you want spaces inside of your object. Otherwise, you can use camel cases and you can ignore that altogether. And now if I console.log my animal, and I clear this out and run it, you can see that that actually did change this value for numLegs to be 5. Okay, so definitely a preference thing. Over time, kind of the team that you work with or kind of the project that you end up working on for yourself, you'll end up kind of going with a style. I personally just prefer this style because I like to save the keystrokes and I'm just so used to camel casing in many languages already. However, it really is up to you, whichever you prefer more. Okay. Now, let's go through a couple of other ideas. So let's say objects-delete.js. I'm going to copy this object that I have just so I can show you some things with the delete keyword and save us some time. So let's say we have the same object. Imagine I want to delete one of the keys from this object, the entire property from this object, which includes a key and a value. So let's say I want to delete the type. Okay, I want to delete type dog. How would we do this? All right, I would encourage you to look on MDN to see if you can figure out how to do this. And once you've done that, let's go through it together. So it turns out that there's this delete keyword in JavaScript that takes a object and the property for that object to delete. So if I say animal, and then I can say, for example, dot type, and then I console log out animal. Let's see what we get. This is objects delete.js. You can see that the type property is now gone from object. Okay, and this works with both syntaxes. I can say delete, and I can say animal dot, and then I can say, for example, ID, just like that, right? And if I run this, now ID is gone. Okay, so this will delete an entire property from our object in JavaScript. Okay, I'm going to create one more file just to keep things clean. I'm going to call this objects-in.js. And I'll paste my animal here again, just so that it's a bit faster to get through this part. Another important thing that we're going to run into a lot is asking the question if an object has a key inside of it. Okay, so for example, imagine that we had a bunch of animals, and these animals all had dozens or maybe even hundreds of properties. It would get really tedious to try to keep track of what's inside each animal and what all the properties are. So what we can do is just ask JavaScript, hey, is this property inside of this object? And that's where we can use the in keyword. So I'm going to show this to you. I'm going to console log out the answer to the question, is name in animal? Okay, so I'm going to say name in animal, just like that. Now this looks really, really strange. I'm going to show you what this actually evaluates to. So I'm going to run this really quick and then we'll kind of go through it. And you can see that we get true. Okay, so now that you've seen it, it probably makes sense, right? But the syntax is kind of strange. There's a left-hand side and then there's a right-hand side. The left-hand side is the key, and the right-hand side is the object that we're looking for that key inside. Okay, so in this case, we're asking, is the name key inside of animal? And the answer is yes, which in JavaScript was either true or false. If I change this to something else, like name2, right? We know name2 is not in here, so if I run this, I should get false, and I do. Okay, what happens if we do this for values? For example, if I look for rar inside of animal, rar is a value, right, for the name key. So what do you think, yes or no? Let's take a look. Turns out no, right? The in keyword only looks for the membership of a key name inside of an object. Okay. Now it turns out this is pretty useful in many cases, and we can use it with other kinds of methods to create more interesting and complex behavior. So next, I want to show you some of the array methods that allow us to look at kind of the keys and the values and even kind of a mix of those two together. So I'm going to create another file. I'm going to call this objects-methods.js. I'll just close this for now. I'm going to put in my animal object again just to save us some time so this video doesn't run too long. How would we get all of the keys inside of animal printed out? I want you to think about that. If you went to MDN and actually solved it by using a method, that's fantastic. That's exactly what we'd want to do. There's technically some other ways we can use, which we'll learn in future videos on how to do this. But the easiest way to do this is to use a method that works on objects, very similar to the methods that we saw with arrays, such as map, filter, and reduce. So with objects, there are a few of these. And if I go back to kind of our page on objects, I kind of hinted at this earlier, right? If we scroll down a bit into this methods section, right, static methods section, there's this, where is it? There's keys right here, object.keys. So I'm going to click on that. And it looks like we have a nice example here. I'll zoom in a tiny bit more. The object.keys method returns an array of a given object's own enumerable property names iterated in the same order that a normal loop would. So for example, if we have an object1, ABC, right, with these values, And then we console log out object.keys of object1. We get back an array with the keys. Now, this looks a little bit strange because we would think that we could do something else. So for example, intuitively, you would think you could just do animal.keys like that, right? So if I try to console.log out animal.keys, let's see what we get. I'm gonna run node objects methods. We get an error, right? It's saying that animal.keys is not a function, and this error is happening on line 9 for me, which is being listed right here when I'm trying to log out animal.keys. Okay, so it's just saying that keys is not a function or a method that works with objects. So if we go back to MDN, it looks like they didn't do it this way, right? They did this weird thing, object.keys, and then they kind of gave it the object as an argument, just like a function. So let's try that. Let's see what the difference is. So if I do console.log object.keys and I pass it my animal object, I'll comment this line out because that's giving me an error. I'll kind of reload my console here and look at that, right? That actually seems to work. We have all of the keys inside of an array, right? ID, name, type, numlegs, and numlegs, right? So there is slight nuances here. I'm not going to get into the details of kind of how this works with these static methods versus the instance methods that we saw with arrays. That'll be in future videos. But just know that you can refer to the documentation, and for objects to get the list of keys as an array, you would do it like this. You would do object.keys and you'd pass it your object as an argument, and you would get back the array of keys. Okay, there are many times where you'll forget the syntax for this or exactly the name of the method, and you'll just Google it and you'll find it. Don't expect yourself to always memorize this. Eventually, the more that you use it, you will just memorize the more commonly used ones. So let's take a look at values. Let's say I want to print out 42, rar, dog, 4, and 4. How would I do that? So you can probably imagine that there is a object.values method that we can use, and we can pass it animal. We can't do animal.values, but we can do object.values of animal, just like we did for keys. And if I run this, you'll see that I do indeed get all of the values for the associated keys. Turns out the order is also maintained, which is kind of nice. Great. Now there's one more where I'd like to show you that is a little bit confusing the first time that you see it, and that's a combination of these two ideas. There are many cases where we want to be able to have the properties given back to us as a pair instead of a separate keys and a separate values. So to do this, it's a very similar method that's called object.entries, and I'll show you this. Object.entries of animal. And if I run this, you'll see that here are the keys, here are the values, and here are the entries. This is an array of arrays where each inner array is the key, comma, the value. Very, very helpful, and we can use this in the future when we learn about other types of loops, for example, to efficiently loop through objects very easily. Okay. There are many ways to use objects in JavaScript. Here are a few of the more commonly used functions. We're going to start to use these in the exercise videos, which we're going to get through next. But I encourage you to read a bit through the documentation and kind of maybe even rewatch parts of this that didn't make sense. This is definitely a more complex topic, and any investment you do into studying these a little bit and practicing with them, breaking them and trying it again will really, really pay off in the future. And if you liked this video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel. As well, I'd love to see any comments that you have or any other methods you have for objects or any errors you might be seeing when you tried this yourself that you weren't able to overcome. Definitely post them in the comments and I'll get back to you and help you as soon as I can. So that said, we're going to do the exercise video for this next, which is going to go through a series of exercises and examples, which we'll code through together. I'll give you a chance to try it out yourself, and then we'll go through the solutions as a group together. And then following that video, we're going to go through a new set of data structures called maps and sets, which I'm really excited to get to as we kind of ramp up to actually getting to our project for the first part of this course. Super excited to get to the exercises. I'll see you there.